Deadly Secrets. Chapter 1. The Unraveling. The quiet town of Hawthorn Falls had always been a place where nothing ever happened. Nestled in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were supposed to stay buried. But that all changed when the first body was found. It was a crisp autumn morning when Sheriff Caleb Ryder got the call. The body of a local teacher, Emily Harris, had been discovered in the woods on the outskirts of town. She had been missing for 3 days, and the whole town had been on edge, hoping she would be found alive. But now hope had turned to horror. As Caleb approached the crime scene, he could feel the tension in the air. The small cluster of deputies, their faces pale, stood in a semicircle around the lifeless body. Emily's body was lying face down in the dirt, her arms splayed out as if she had tried to crawl away from her attacker. But it wasn't the sight of the body that sent a chill down Caleb's spine. It was the look of sheer terror frozen on her face. "Who found her?" Caleb asked, his voice gruff with the weight of the situation. "Joe Miller," Deputy Kate Lawson replied, her voice trembling slightly. "He was out hunting and stumbled across the body." Caleb nodded, his mind racing. Joe was one of the town's more reclusive residents, a man who kept to himself and had a reputation for being a bit odd. But he had never been in trouble with the law, and Caleb had no reason to suspect him of anything more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Where is he now?" Caleb asked. "Over there, by the patrol car," Kate said, nodding toward the edge of the clearing. Caleb walked over to where Joe was sitting on the hood of the car, his head in his hands. He looked up as Caleb approached, his eyes wide with shock. "I didn't do it, Sheriff," Joe said before Caleb could even ask a question. "I swear, I just found her like that." "I believe you, Joe," Caleb said, his voice steady. "But I need to ask you a few questions. Can you do that for me?" Joe nodded, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. Caleb could see the fear in his eyes, but there was something else there too, something that made Caleb's instincts prickle. "Did you see anyone else in the woods?" Caleb asked. Joe shook his head. "No, just her. It was quiet. Too quiet. Like the birds knew something bad had happened." Caleb frowned. Something about this didn't sit right with him. Hawthorn Falls was a small town, but it wasn't isolated. People came and went all the time, especially during hunting season. But for someone to commit a murder and leave the body out here in the open felt too brazen. "All right, Joe," Caleb said finally. "I want you to go home and try to get some rest. But don't leave town, okay? I might have more questions later." Joe nodded again, his relief palpable as he climbed into his truck and drove away. Caleb watched him go, his mind still churning with questions. Who could have done this? And why? But as he turned back to the crime scene, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Hawthorn Falls was about to be torn apart by secrets that had been buried for far too long. Chapter 2. The second victim. The sun had barely risen the next day when Caleb was called out to another crime scene. This time, it was on the other side of town, near the old mill that had been abandoned for years. The victim was a young woman, no older than 20, and the similarities to Emily Harris's murder were impossible to ignore. Her body was found lying face up, her eyes wide open in fear, just like Emily's. Caleb felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he surveyed the scene. This was no coincidence. They were dealing with a serial killer. "Same as before," Kate said, her voice shaky as she approached Caleb. No sign of a struggle, no witnesses, and the victim's belongings untouched. "It's like whoever did this wanted us to find her like this." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts spinning. 2 murders in 2 days. Hawthorn Falls hadn't seen a single homicide in over a decade, and now they had a killer on the loose. This wasn't just some random act of violence. It was calculated, planned. "Do we know who she is?" Caleb asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. Kate nodded, her face grim. "Lena Thompson. She worked at the diner on Main Street. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, cursing under his breath. Lena had been a sweet girl, always with a smile on her face. She didn't have any enemies that he knew of, which made this all the more confusing. "We need to keep this quiet for now," Caleb said, his voice firm. "If word gets out that we have a serial killer in town, there's going to be panic. And we can't afford that." Kate nodded in agreement, but Caleb could see the worry etched on her face. She wasn't the only one. Caleb felt it too, deep in his bones. This was just the beginning, and whoever was behind these murders wasn't going to stop until they had finished whatever twisted plan they had in mind. As they worked to process the crime scene, Caleb's thoughts kept returning to the town's past. Hawthorn Falls had always been a place of secrets, a town where people kept their skeletons well hidden. But now, those secrets were starting to surface, and Caleb had the sinking feeling that the murders were just the tip of the iceberg. He had to find the killer before they struck again. But more than that, he had to uncover the truth about what was really going on in Hawthorn Falls. A truth that could destroy the town if it ever came to light. Chapter 3. Buried Truths. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was at play. As he sat in his office that evening, the files of the two murders spread out before him, he stared at the photographs of Emily Harris and Lena Thompson. Two young women, both well-liked in the community, both brutally murdered with no apparent motive. And yet, Caleb knew there had to be a connection. He picked up the phone and called Kate. "Meet me at the station," he said. "We need to dig into the victims' backgrounds. There's something we're missing." Kate arrived within minutes, her face drawn with fatigue. The murders had taken a toll on everyone, but Caleb could see that Kate was determined to find the killer. Together, they began to comb through the lives of Emily and Lena, looking for anything that might link them. Emily was a teacher, no criminal record, no enemies that we know of, Kate said, flipping through the pages of the file. Lena worked at the diner, same story. Everyone liked her. But look at this. She handed Caleb a photograph of Lena from a few months ago, standing in front of the diner with a group of friends. In the background, barely noticeable, was a shadowy figure watching them from across the street. "Who is that?" Caleb asked, squinting at the image. "I don't know," Kate replied, "but it's the only unusual thing I've found so far. It's like this person is deliberately staying in the shadows." Caleb felt a shiver run down his spine. "Check the town's surveillance cameras from that day," he said. "Maybe we can get a clearer picture of who that is." While Kate worked on the surveillance footage, Caleb focused on the town's history. Hawthorn Falls had been founded over 100 years ago, and like many old towns, it had its share of legends and dark tales. But none of those stories seemed relevant to the current murders, until Caleb stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. In the archives, he found an old newspaper article from the 1950s about a series of murders that had taken place in Hawthorn Falls. The killer had never been caught, but the murders had abruptly stopped after the last victim. A young woman who had been found in the woods, her face frozen in terror. The details were eerily similar to the recent cases. "Kate, you need to see this," Caleb called out, his voice urgent. Kate walked over and looked at the article. "Are you saying these murders are connected to something that happened 70 years ago?" she asked, incredulous. "I don't know," Caleb admitted, "but it's too similar to ignore. And look at the last line here." He pointed to the final sentence of the article, which mentioned that the killer had been rumored to be a member of one of the town's most prominent families, a family that still lived in Hawthorn Falls. "Do you think the killer could be a descendant of that family?" Kate asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's possible," Caleb said, "but even if it's not, someone knows about these old murders and is copying them. We need to find out who that is before they strike again." They worked late into the night, piecing together the connections between the past and the present. As the hours ticked by, the town outside grew quieter, the darkness closing in around them. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. a time that was rapidly running out. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Kate looked up from her computer screen. "I found something," she said, her voice filled with a mix of triumph and dread. The surveillance footage shows the same figure watching both Emily and Lena in the days leading up to their deaths. "And it's not just a shadow, it's a man. We need to identify him, fast." Caleb nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. Whoever this man was, he was the key to everything. And if they didn't stop him soon, another innocent life would be lost. Chapter 4. A Town on Edge. By the time Caleb and Kate started knocking on doors, the sun was fully up, casting long shadows across the sleepy town. Word of the murders had begun to spread, despite their best efforts to keep it quiet, and a palpable sense of fear hung in the air. People who usually greeted them with a smile now glanced nervously at their badges, wary of what news they might bring. Their first stop was the home of Margaret Whitfield, the oldest resident of Hawthorn Falls. Margaret had lived through more of the town's history than anyone else, and if there were secrets to be uncovered, she would know them. The elderly woman answered the door with a cautious smile, her eyes sharp despite her advanced age. "Morning, Sheriff Deputy," she greeted them, stepping aside to let them in. "What brings you to my door this early?" "Morning, Mrs. Whitfield," Caleb replied, tipping his hat. "We were hoping you could help us with some information about the town's past." Margaret led them to the living room, where she eased herself into a worn armchair. "I've seen a lot in my time, Sheriff," she said, her voice strong and steady. "But what is it you're looking for?" Caleb pulled out the old newspaper article and handed it to her. "Do you remember anything about these murders?" Margaret took the article, her hands trembling slightly as she read. "I remember," she said quietly. "My mother used to talk about those murders, said they were the work of the devil himself." "Do you know who the suspect was?" Kate asked gently. Margaret shook her head. No one knew for sure, but there were whispers. People said it was someone from the Lawson family, rich folk who lived up on the hill. But nothing was ever proven, and the killings stopped as suddenly as they started. "The Lawson family," Caleb repeated, exchanging a glance with Kate. "Do any of them still live in town?" "Just old Walter Lawson," Margaret replied. "He's the last of his line, lives alone in that big house. Keeps to himself mostly." Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. Walter Lawson was a name he knew well, a reclusive old man who rarely ventured into town, and someone who had always given Caleb an uneasy feeling. Could he be connected to the murders either in the past or now? "We appreciate your help, Mrs. Whitfield," Caleb said, rising to leave. "If you think of anything else, please let us know." As they left Margaret's house, Kate turned to Caleb, her brow furrowed in concern. "Do you really think it could be Walter Lawson? He's nearly 80 years old." "I don't know," Caleb admitted, "but we can't rule anything out. We need to talk to him, see if he knows anything." They drove up to the Lawson estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of town. The house was as imposing as Caleb remembered, tall, with dark windows that seemed to watch them as they approached. The front door creaked open before they even had a chance to knock, revealing Walter Lawson himself. His frame stooped, but his eyes still sharp as ever. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Sheriff?" Walter asked, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "We need to ask you a few questions, Mr. Lawson," Caleb said, keeping his tone neutral. "It's about some old cases that may be connected to recent events." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly, but he stepped aside, allowing them in. "Very well, but I doubt I'll be of much help. The past is long buried, Sheriff." Caleb exchanged a glance with Kate as they followed Walter into his dimly lit study. The air inside was thick with the smell of old books and dust, and Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into a place where time had stood still. But as they began to question Walter, it became clear that the old man was sharper than he appeared. His answers were evasive, his tone dismissive, and yet there was something in his eyes, something that told Caleb he was hiding more than he was letting on. "We know about the murders in the 1950s, Caleb said finally, watching Walter's reaction closely. "And we know there were rumors about your family's involvement." Walter's expression didn't change, but there was a brief flicker in his eyes. Anger, perhaps, or fear. "Those were just that, rumors," he said, his voice low. "And they should stay that way. Digging up the past won't help you, Sheriff. It never does." As they left the estate, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to the truth. Closer to something that someone, perhaps even Walter Dawson himself, would kill to keep hidden. Chapter 5. The Shadow Lurking. The encounter with Walter Dawson left Caleb with more questions than answers. As he and Kate drove back to the station, the clouds above grew heavy, casting an ominous shadow over Hawthorn Falls. It was as if the town itself was reacting to the dark secrets that were beginning to surface. "We need to dig deeper into the Dawson family history," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "There has to be something there that connects to these murders. I don't believe in coincidences. I'll start by looking into property records and old town documents," Kate replied, determination in her voice. "Maybe there's something buried in there that can help us." Back at the station, they split up the tasks. While Kate delved into the town's archives, Caleb decided to follow up on another lead that had been nagging at him since the beginning. The victims, Emily Harris and Lena Thompson, had no obvious connection, but Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they were missing. He pulled out their files again, this time focusing on their personal lives. Emily had been a teacher, well-liked and respected, with no known enemies. Lena, on the other hand, had worked at the diner and lived a quiet life. But there was one small detail that caught Caleb's attention. Lena had recently broken off a relationship with a man who had a history of violent behavior, someone who had left town shortly after the breakup. Caleb's gut told him this was important. He decided to track down this man, a drifter named Nick Harrow, who had been living on the fringes of society for years. If Nick had a grudge against Lena, he could be a potential suspect, or at the very least, he might know something about what was going on. It took Caleb several hours and numerous calls to locate Nick. He finally tracked him down to a rundown motel on the outskirts of the neighboring town. As Caleb approached the door of Nick's room, his hand hovered over his gun. There was no telling what kind of man he was about to confront. The door creaked open after the second knock, revealing a disheveled man with bloodshot eyes. Nick Harrow looked like he hadn't slept in days, and the smell of alcohol was strong on his breath. "What do you want?" Nick slurred, eyeing Caleb suspiciously. "Nick Harrow? I'm Sheriff Caleb Ryder from Hawthorn Falls. I need to ask you a few questions about Lena Thompson." At the mention of Lena's name, Nick's expression darkened. "I didn't do anything to her," he snapped. "We broke up and that's it. I haven't seen her since." "Where were you 2 nights ago?" Caleb asked, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Here," Nick replied, gesturing around the filthy room. "I was here drinking. Ask the manager. He'll tell you I didn't leave." Caleb didn't entirely believe Nick, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested he wasn't the killer. He was angry, sure, but not the calculating type that could commit such brutal murders. "Did Lena ever mention anything strange to you? Something or someone that might have made her nervous or scared?" Caleb probed, hoping for a lead. Nick hesitated, rubbing his temples as if trying to remember. "She mentioned some guy a few times," he finally said. "Said he was always hanging around the diner, staring at her. Gave her the creeps." "Did she ever describe him?" Caleb asked, his interest piqued. "Just that he was quiet, kept to himself. Tall, wore a lot of dark clothes. I didn't pay much attention. I figured it was just some harmless weirdo." Caleb thanked Nick for his time and left the motel with more questions than answers. Who was this man Lena had described? And could he be the same shadowy figure they had seen in the surveillance footage? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the picture they were forming was more terrifying than Caleb had anticipated. When he returned to the station, Kate was waiting for him, her face pale. "Caleb, you need to see this," she said, leading him to the back room where she had spread out Old Town records across the table. "What did you find?" Caleb asked, his heart pounding. "Remember how we suspected the Dawson family might be involved?" Kate began, her voice trembling slightly. "Well, I found something in the old property records, something that connects the Dawson estate to the original murders in the 1950s. There's a piece of land, hidden deep in the woods behind their house. It's not listed on any recent maps, but it used to belong to the Dawson family." "And?" Caleb prompted, leaning in closer. Kate looked up at him, her eyes filled with dread. "The land was sold off years ago, but the last recorded owner was Walter Dawson's father. And the title transfer, Caleb, it was never completed. The land is still in the Dawson family's name." Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. "So you're saying the land could still be connected to the Dawsons, and possibly the murders?" Kate nodded. "And there's more. The land was rumored to be the site of some strange rituals. People in town used to talk about it, but no one ever proved anything. I think we need to check it out." Caleb agreed, but he knew they had to be careful. If the Dawsons were involved, confronting them head-on could be dangerous. But time was running out. The killer had already struck twice, and Caleb had the sinking feeling that they were gearing up for something even more horrifying. As they prepared to head out to the Dawson estate, Caleb's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number, and it contained only 2 words: tick-tock. The clock was indeed ticking, and Caleb knew that whatever they were about to uncover in those dark woods could be the key to stopping a killer, or it could be the final step into a trap that had been set long ago. Chapter 6. Into the darkness. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Caleb and Kate arrived at the edge of the Dawson property. The dense woods loomed ahead, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows in the dim twilight. Caleb's instincts were on high alert, every fiber of his being telling him that they were walking into something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. "Are you sure about this?" Kate asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she glanced at the dark path before them. "We don't have a choice," Caleb replied, his tone grim. "If there's a chance the killer is hiding out there, we need to find them before they strike again." They moved cautiously through the woods, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the eerie silence. As they ventured deeper, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally came to a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, half hidden by overgrown brush and vines. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but there was something about it that sent a shiver down Caleb's spine. "This has to be it," Kate whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "The land, the old Dawson property. It all leads here." Caleb nodded, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "Stay close," he instructed, moving toward the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as he pushed it open with the barrel of his gun. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. The cabin was small, with just one room, but it was filled with old, rotting furniture and strange symbols carved into the walls. But it wasn't the symbols that caught Caleb's attention. It was the trapdoor in the floor, barely visible in the dim light. "Over here," he called to Kate, pointing to the trapdoor. "This is what we've been looking for." Together, they pried the trapdoor open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. A foul stench wafted up from below, and Caleb felt his stomach churn with dread. Whatever was down there, it wasn't good. "Ready?" Caleb asked, glancing at Kate. She nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. "Let's do this." They descended the stairs, the darkness swallowing them whole as they moved deeper into the ground. The air grew colder, and the smell of decay intensified. When they finally reached the bottom, Caleb's flashlight revealed a small underground chamber, lined with stone walls that looked ancient. But it was what lay in the center of the chamber that made Caleb's blood run cold. There, on the ground, were the remains of several bodies, their skeletal hands reaching out as if they had tried to escape their fate. And standing above them, his back turned to the stairway, was a figure dressed in dark, tattered clothes, holding a knife that gleamed in the light. "Stop right there," Caleb commanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls as he aimed his gun at the figure. The figure turned slowly, revealing the gaunt, haunted face of Walter Dawson. His eyes were wild, filled with a madness that sent a chill down Caleb's spine. "You shouldn't have come here," Walter rasped, his voice low and menacing. "This is sacred ground, our family's legacy." Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. "Put the knife down, Walter. We can end this now. Just put it down." Walter stared at him, his grip on the knife tightening. "You don't understand," he hissed. "This isn't just about me. It's about protecting this town. The darkness, it needs to be fed. And if it's not, it will devour us all." "That's just superstition, Walter." Caleb shot back, his voice firm. "You're not protecting anyone. You're just killing innocent people." For a moment, Walter seemed to waver, the knife shaking in his hand. But then, as if possessed by some inner demon, his resolve hardened. "No," he whispered. "It's too late." Before Caleb could react, Walter raised the knife to his own throat, his eyes never leaving Caleb's. "The darkness will take you all," he said, a twisted smile on his lips, and then he slashed the blade across his throat. Blood sprayed across the chamber, and Walter collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing as life drained from him. Caleb and Kate rushed forward, but it was too late. Walter Dawson was dead, his final horrific act completed. The chamber fell into an eerie silence, the only sound the drip of blood pooling on the cold stone floor. Caleb holstered his gun, staring down at Walter's lifeless body with a mix of anger and sorrow. The man had been driven to madness by the very darkness he had tried to control. "We need to get out of here," Kate said quietly, her voice trembling with shock. "We need to report this. Get a forensics team down here." Caleb nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that Walter's death wasn't the end of it, that the darkness Walter spoke of still lingered, waiting for its next opportunity. As they climbed back up the narrow staircase, leaving the horrors of the underground chamber behind, Caleb couldn't help but wonder how deep the roots of this curse went. Walter's father had started it, but how many others had known? How many had been complicit in the town's dark history? Back in the fresh air, the weight of the past seemed to lift slightly, but Caleb knew the scars of this night would remain with him, and with Hawthorn Falls for a long time. The secrets they had uncovered had been deadly, tearing apart the lives of innocent people. But even as the case was closed, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that some secrets still remained buried, waiting for their moment to resurface. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Caleb and Kate stood in silence, the town of Hawthorn Falls stretching out before them. It was a new day, but the shadows of the past would linger for a long time. Chapter 7. The Final Revelation. Walter Dawson stood frozen, his wild eyes locked onto Caleb's. The blade in his hand gleamed under the faint light from Caleb's flashlight, its sharp edge catching every subtle movement. The underground chamber seemed to close in around them, the air thick with the weight of the secrets buried there. "Put the knife down, Walter," Caleb repeated, his voice steady but firm, even as adrenaline coursed through his veins. "It's over. There's nowhere left to run." Walter's lips curled into a twisted smile, one that sent a shiver of unease down Caleb's spine. "You think you know the truth, Sheriff?" Walter said, his voice low and almost taunting. "But you don't know anything. This town, these woods, they're cursed. We're all just playing our parts. Caleb's grip on his gun tightened. What are you talking about? The murders in the 1950s, the recent killings, how are you involved? Walter's eyes flicked to the bodies on the ground, his expression one of both pride and sorrow. My father started this, he said softly. He believed in the old ways, in the rituals that kept the darkness at bay. But the rituals, they required sacrifices. Human sacrifices, Kate whispered, horror dawning on her face as she pieced it together. The murders weren't random. They were part of a ritual. Walter nodded, his expression grave. My father made the first sacrifices. When the killings stopped, everyone thought the nightmare was over. But it wasn't. The darkness, it always comes back. Is that why you killed Emily and Lena? Caleb asked, his voice cold as he fought to maintain control. To continue your father's work? Walter's smile faded, replaced by a look of desperation. I didn't want to, he said, his voice cracking. But the darkness demanded it. It whispered to me, told me what I had to do. If I didn't, it would consume the town, destroy everything. Caleb took a step closer, keeping his gun trained on Walter. You don't have to do this anymore, Walter. We can end this now. Just put down the knife, and we'll figure this out together. For a moment, it seemed like Walter might listen. His hand trembled, the knife lowering slightly. But then, something in his eyes shifted, a look of resolute madness. No, he whispered, more to himself than to them. It's too late. The darkness is here. Before Caleb could react, Walter raised the knife and slashed it across his own throat in one swift, brutal motion. Blood sprayed across the chamber walls as he collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing as life drained from him. Caleb and Kate rushed forward, but it was already too late. Walter Dawson was dead, his final sacrifice made. The chamber fell into an eerie silence, the only sound the drip of blood pooling on the cold stone floor. Caleb holstered his gun, staring down at Walter's lifeless body with a mixture of anger and sorrow. The man had been driven to madness by the very darkness he had tried to control. We need to get out of here, Kate said quietly, her voice trembling with shock. We need to report this. Get a forensics team down here. Caleb nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that Walter's death wasn't the end of it, that the darkness Walter spoke of still lingered, waiting for its next opportunity. As they climbed back up the narrow staircase, leaving the horrors of the underground chamber behind, Caleb couldn't help but wonder how deep the roots of this curse went. Walter's father had started it, but how many others had known? How many had been complicit in the town's dark history? Back in the fresh air, the weight of the past seemed to lift slightly, but Caleb knew the scars of this night would remain with him, and with Hawthorn Falls for a long time. The secrets they had uncovered had been deadly, tearing apart the lives of innocent people. But even as the case was closed, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that some secrets still remained buried, waiting for their moment to resurface. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Caleb and Kate stood in silence, the town of Hawthorn Falls stretching out before them. It was a new day, but the shadows of the past would linger for a long time. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.